Yeah, I love this because it's something we do. We think a lot about, and I had the privilege of training some teams up in the Panhandle of Florida earlier this week, and we spoke a lot about both of those things. So let's maybe talk about prompting first. As we all know, there is such diversity among the AAC, among the population of individuals who use AAC, right? And so many different AAC tools that they're learning. So it makes sense that that one strategy for prompting is not going to be appropriate for all of them, right? If we think of just one etiology, if we chip off, autism, for example, right? And we all know these learners are so different one from another. And then, a whole slew of other clinical populations. So a lot of heterogeneity there. And the apps and the AAC devices are so different. Too. So one early message, of course, that we've all heard is that the prompting needs to be really individualized. And I know when I say that to my graduate students, they kind of roll their eyes at me. It's not a very satisfying answer. It's like, yeah, well, what does that really mean? Like, that tells me nothing. So let me say one thing that applies to every kind of learner and every type of AAC in terms of how we should be using prompts, and that is with great respect, respectfully, and in ways that honor that person, right? Our goal is to empower them, not to get them to comply, right? So for a beginning learner or someone who is getting a brand new device or is being introduced to a new AAC app or a new page set or new vocabulary, we would probably use kind of a most to least prompt hierarchy, right? Because we want them to be maximally successful at first. And usually that means that they're going to need a lot of prompting and a lot of support so that they don't make a lot of mistakes, right? We want to give them practice doing it right? They're going to get enough practice without us doing it wrong. We want them to get practice, get that experience, get the feel of doing it right? And I always use the analogy as a little girl learning to ride a bike, because I think a lot of us can have that memory, right? It was such a freeing feeling, learning to, getting your first bike and learning to ride a bike. So I remember my dad taking me back in the alley behind our apartment, and I have a summer birthday, so I must have gotten a new bike for my birthday. And he put me on the bike, the shiny red bike, and my little feet on the pedals, and his one hand was behind my bum holding the seat, and his other hand was on the handlebars. And as he moved the bike forward, right, my feet, because they were on the pedals, my legs, made that reciprocal motion. And my brain says, oh, that's what pedaling feels like? That's what this is supposed to be, right? So it helped me form that connection of what other people were doing to make this bike riding thing happen. And now I didn't have all the pieces in place, right? So he'd let go for a few seconds, and I didn't have the balance, so I'd wobble, right? And he'd quickly grab onto it as I got my balance. Excuse me. And I didn't really know that I had to power myself. He was moving along and running with me. But little by little, right, I was able to put those pieces together because my body was given that experience of what it feels like when you're doing it well. So with the beginning communicator, my intent is to help them get it right? And that usually means a lot of physical guidance. But they may come to me as an interventionist with a body that doesn't tolerate a lot of touch all that well, right? It doesn't feel comfortable to them, right? Or they may come to me with an intervention history that caused them to be resistant to being assisted in that way, right? I get a lot of individuals on my caseload. I love working with adolescents and the slightly older guys, right? And a lot of times they've experienced so much failure, right, in their lives that, they're not so keen on us getting in their face and helping them through things because they're like, okay, here's one more thing I'm not doing quite right, and I just got to tolerate this lady like the scores of others who have come before her, doing things to me. So I really have to rethink my approach and adjust, because if I use a lot of physical, guidance with those kinds of folks, I'm probably going to make things worse, not better. I'm probably not going to achieve my goal. I've got to adjust and look for other ways to guide them, right? So as I do that, and they're like, they're acquiring some skills, but maybe, I don't know, later on, maybe they've got some emerging skills, but they're not using them on a consistent basis, right? So at that point, I got to rethink my prompting strategy entirely, and there's where I might flip it. So you know what to do, you've got the feel of it, and now I really want to focus on you getting independent or more independent, right? I still want you to be successful, so I don't want to yank all the supports that allowed you to be successful, but I sure don't want to create an experience where you're stuck with me all the time or somebody else all the time in order to be able to do this. So now I might switch my prompt hierarchy to that least to most prompt hierarchy. So those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about with prompting. But you also asked, Lucas, about modeling. And that can be a kind of confusing term, right? Because we use modeling for two distinct things, right? So you asked about it in the context of prompting, right? And it's true that modeling is one option for prompting to guide a learner toward a correct or a desirable response. But I think the more important use of modeling, right, in this conversation is not modeling for prompting. It's about using AAC to create an appropriate language learning environment, right? It's about us speaking AAC to them because AAC is the language that they're trying to learn, right? And so as we all know, especially Ajit, who has a beautiful little one at home, right? We speak to typically developing children for a year or so before we expect them to produce the words. And these are kids with no problems whatsoever, right? But for AAC learners, they never have that opportunity, right? When we introduce AAC, they have 0 months of opportunity of observing competent AAC models. And if the kids don't make significant progress with their AAC within, I don't know, the first year, we question their abilities. We doubt their learning abilities, right? We want to change directions. We want to change horses in the middle of that stream without acknowledging that we probably put them in a completely unfair situation, right? We're asking them to learn this language of AAC, this language of pictures, this language of technology that hardly anyone in their lives really speak. And look, the reality is, if you ask me to learn a foreign language, Ajit lives in a country where there are many, many, many languages and many, many, many more dialects. If he tried to teach me one of those, and I was not around people who spoke in that language, look, the reality is I wouldn't be able to do it, and I have no conditions that interfere with my language learning ability, but I just couldn't do it. And that's pretty much the situation that's confronting most AAC learners today. And I think we're getting better at this, but we've got a long way to go, right? And unfortunately, I think our educational systems and the medical systems that fund the services we provide do not give us any support for us as professionals or parents developing the skills that we need to be competent speakers of AAC. And that is a prerequisite, I believe, to be a competent interventionist or a competent instructor of AAC. So we're in a really tough place because Medicaid and Medicare and the school system doesn't have a lot of tolerance for me getting up to speed with a particular app, right, or a particular vocabulary set, or a particular SGD. And in the meantime, I need to be speaking in that 24/7. So I think we know that we need to get better at this. We're all still struggling with the same thing. I think the takeaway for all of us is we have to manage our expectations. Let's stop yanking things from kids. Let's stop changing courses in the middle of the stream. If we haven't evaluated the situation and come to the conclusion that they in fact have had a fair language learning platform upon which this AAC instruction can be built. If we look at that situation and say, look, they haven't had 6 months, a year of competent models of observing AAC being spoken before that AAC instruction is happening, I think we're really on shaky ground, assigning the responsibility for the lack of learning on the part of the student. I think we have to be very, very careful there.